Don't touch me." The words didn't echo, but they cut through the $12 million glass boardroom like a blade, sharp enough to freeze 20 executives mid-breath as Victoria Hale pulled her hand back just inches before it met Marcus Ellington's, her expression tightening into something polite on the surface but unmistakably cold underneath, and for a second, just a second, Marcus's hand remained extended in the air, steady, unshaken, as if time itself had paused to watch what she would do next, and then she turned. Smiling, offering that same hand to a man beside him without hesitation, sealing the insult in silence more powerful than any raised voice, because this wasn't an accident, it was a decision, one made in front of everyone, one that said more than words ever could, and the room felt it, that subtle shift, that quiet discomfort that no one wanted to name, but everyone understood, especially Marcus, who slowly lowered his hand without a word, his face unreadable, his posture unchanged, like a man who had seen this moment before and learned long ago that reacting too soon only gave it power, the skyline of Manhattan stretching behind him in clean lines of steel and glass, reflecting a morning that was supposed to be about a $2.4 billion deal, a partnership that could reshape entire markets, and yet here they were, watching something much smaller, and somehow much heavier, unfold in real time. Victoria adjusting her sleeve as if brushing off the interaction entirely, her voice smooth as she continued, "Let's keep this efficient, we have a tight schedule," never once looking back at Marcus as if he had already been dismissed from relevance, and around the table, eyes shifted, some glancing down at their notes, others exchanging quick looks that said everything they weren't willing to say out loud, because no one wanted to challenge her, not here, not now, not when she held what they believed was control of the deal. But there was one person who didn't look away, Ethan Cole, a junior analyst seated near the end of the table, his pen hovering above a legal pad as he replayed what he had just seen, something about it sitting wrong in a way he couldn't explain. Because Marcus hadn't reacted the way anyone else would have, hadn't defended himself, hadn't even blinked, just watched, quietly, like he was cataloguing every second, every word, every decision, and that calm, that stillness, didn't feel like weakness, it felt like patience, the kind that waits for the right moment instead of chasing it, and as Victoria began outlining terms, confidently directing the room, believing she had already established the hierarchy without needing to say it out loud. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together, his gaze steady, distant almost, as if the deal in front of him was no longer the most important thing in the room, as if something else had just been set in motion, something no one else could see yet, not even Victoria, who smiled as she spoke about projections, about growth, about control, unaware that the moment she refused that handshake, she had already changed the outcome of everything that was about to happen next. Victoria did not slow down after that moment, she accelerated, her voice filling the room with polished confidence as she walked through slides projected across a 70-inch screen, numbers climbing into the billions, projections stretching across 5 fiscal years, each sentence reinforcing the same message that she believed this deal belonged to her, that control was already decided. That Marcus Ellington was simply a placeholder in a chair that did not matter, and yet Marcus did not interrupt, did not challenge, did not even reach for the documents in front of him. Instead he listened, not to her words but to her tone, the certainty behind it, the assumption that no one in that room would question her judgment, especially not him, and across the table Ethan Cole shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes moving between Victoria and Marcus as if trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality. Because something about Marcus did not match the role he was being assigned, not the way he sat, not the way he observed, not the way he seemed completely unaffected by a moment that would have unsettled anyone else, and that stillness began to feel louder than Victoria's voice. Louder than the presentation itself, until even a senior attorney seated near the center of the table cleared her throat softly, glancing toward Marcus for just a second too long, as if waiting for him to speak. But he did not, he simply leaned forward slightly and adjusted the cuff of his shirt with deliberate calm, his watch catching the light for a brief moment, understated but precise. The kind of detail that did not announce wealth but confirmed it to those who knew what to look for, and Victoria noticed it, just for a fraction of a second, her words pausing almost imperceptibly before she continued, sharper now, more assertive, as if compensating for something she could not fully explain. "We expect full alignment before execution," she said, her eyes briefly landing on Marcus, not to include him but to measure him, to remind the room who she believed held authority, and then she added, "And we do not move forward with unnecessary variables," the word variables hanging in the air longer than it should have, directed without being named, and a few people at the table shifted again, discomfort rising but still unspoken, because challenging her would mean risking position, risking influence, risking access to a deal this size, and that silence, that collective hesitation, was exactly what had allowed moments like this to happen again and again in rooms just like this one. Marcus knew that. He had lived that pattern long before he ever sat at a table like this. He remembered a conference room in Chicago 20 years earlier, smaller, less polished, where a handshake had also been withheld, where someone had said he was not the right fit for their image, where he had walked out without a word and built something bigger than the room that rejected him, and now here he was again, same energy, different scale, except this time he did not need approval, he did not need validation, and most importantly he did not need to prove anything in that moment, because power, real power, did not rush to defend itself. It waited, it observed, and when it moved, it did not argue, it changed outcomes, and as Victoria finally closed her presentation with a confident nod, sliding the printed agreements across the table toward the executive team, she smiled as if everything was already decided, as if the deal was already hers. "Let us finalize," she said, picking up her pen and preparing to sign, completely unaware that the most important decision in the room had already been made, just not by her. The pen in Victoria Hale's hand hovered for just a second longer than necessary, not because she hesitated, but because she enjoyed the moment, the illusion of control settling across the room like a final verdict, and then she signed, smooth, confident, her name pressed into paper that carried the weight of billions, followed by the others at the table one by one, each signature stacking on top of the last, sealing what they believed was a done deal, while Marcus Ellington remained still, watching the process unfold without reaching for his own pen, without interrupting, without even leaning forward, and that absence began to feel louder than any objection, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore, until Ethan Cole finally noticed it clearly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced down at the agreement and then back at Marcus, because there was a space waiting, a final signature line that remained untouched. And yet no one was asking about it, no one was acknowledging it. As if the room had collectively decided it was not necessary, or worse, that Marcus himself was not necessary, and Victoria, sensing the shift but refusing to validate it, closed the folder with a soft but deliberate motion. "We will proceed with execution immediately," she said, her tone final, authoritative, already moving past the moment, already stepping into the role of someone who believed the outcome was hers to command. And a few executives nodded, some out of agreement, others out of habit, but Marcus finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to draw attention back to him without demanding it, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the table as he looked at the signed documents, then at Victoria, his expression calm but focused now, no longer distant, no longer observing from the outside, but fully present, and when he spoke, his voice was low, measured, the kind that did not need volume to carry weight. "Is that your final position?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a question of uncertainty, but as confirmation, and the room stilled again, because something in the way he said it shifted the atmosphere, like a quiet line being drawn that only a few people could see. Victoria met his gaze for the first time without looking away, her posture straightening slightly, her confidence intact but sharpened. "It is," she replied, firm, controlled, unwilling to give even an inch, and Marcus nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging more than just her answer, as if marking the moment itself, committing it to something larger than the room, and then he reached for his phone, not in haste, not in reaction, but with the same deliberate calm he had carried from the beginning, his thumb tapping the screen once, twice, sending a message that no one else could read, no one else could interpret, and then he placed the phone back down beside him, folding his hands again as if nothing had happened, as if the most important action of the entire meeting had just taken place in complete silence, and Victoria, mistaking that silence for compliance, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, turning to gather her materials, already speaking about timelines, about integration, about next steps, while Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze steady, patient, almost distant again, like a man who had just pressed a button no one else in the room even knew existed, and somewhere beneath the polished surface of that boardroom, beneath the numbers and signatures and controlled voices, something had already begun to shift, quietly, invisibly, and far beyond anyone's immediate reach, including Victoria's. The meeting did not end with applause or celebration, it ended with movement, chairs sliding back, folders closing, voices lowering into smaller conversations that carried the quiet confidence of people who believed they had just secured something permanent, and Victoria Hale stood at the center of it, receiving nods, handshakes, and affirmations that reinforced the same illusion, that she had just finalized a deal that would elevate her position even further. Her posture relaxed now, her tone lighter, already discussing follow-up dinners and press strategy as if the outcome had never been in question, while Marcus Ellington remained seated for a moment longer than everyone else, not out of hesitation, but intention, watching the room empty in layers, observing who approached Victoria, who avoided him, who pretended not to notice him at all. And each detail settled into place with quiet precision, because this was never just about one moment, it was about a pattern, and patterns only revealed themselves when you stopped interrupting them. Across the room Ethan Cole lingered as well, gathering his notes slower than necessary, his attention still fixed on Marcus, because something about the way he carried himself did not match the way he had been treated, and that contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore, especially now that the deal was supposedly complete and yet Marcus had never signed, had never been asked to sign, and yet had not objected, which did not feel like oversight, it felt like design, and that realization sat heavily in Ethan's chest as he watched Marcus finally stand, smooth, unhurried, adjusting his jacket as if the entire meeting had unfolded exactly as expected, while Victoria approached him once more, not out of respect, but closure, her expression composed, professional, the kind of smile reserved for formal endings rather than genuine acknowledgement. "We will have our teams coordinate the next phase," she said, her tone efficient, distant, already moving on, and Marcus met her gaze without stepping closer, without offering his hand again, his voice calm, almost reflective. "Make sure they are ready for everything that follows," he replied, not as advice, not as concern, but as a statement that seemed to carry more weight than the words themselves, and for a brief second Victoria's smile tightened, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to reveal that something about his tone did not sit comfortably, something she could not quite define, and yet she dismissed it just as quickly, turning away to rejoin her team, because confidence, especially the kind built on control, rarely allowed space for doubt, and within minutes the boardroom emptied completely, leaving behind nothing but the faint reflection of the skyline in the glass walls and the quiet echo of decisions that felt final. Marcus was the last to leave, pausing at the door for a fraction of a second, his phone vibrating once in his pocket, a single notification, brief, precise, confirming what had already begun beyond that room, beyond that building, beyond Victoria's awareness, and he did not check it immediately, he did not need to, because he already knew what it would say, and as he stepped into the hallway, the controlled environment of the boardroom gave way to something larger, something less predictable, but also something far more real, and behind him, on the polished table where signatures still rested, one line remained untouched, one name absent, one piece missing that no one had questioned, not yet. And outside, the city moved forward as it always did, unaware that somewhere within its systems, within its networks of capital and control, something had already shifted, quietly, precisely, and entirely on Marcus Ellington's terms. The hallway outside the boardroom carried a different kind of silence, softer but heavier, the kind that follows decisions people believe are final, and Victoria Hale walked through it surrounded by her team, her heel steady against the polished floor, her voice already shifting into strategy, into timelines, into the language of someone who thought the next phase had already begun. "We announce within 48 hours, she said, her tone controlled, confident. "I want media lined up before the markets open," and heads nodded around her, assistants typing, advisors agreeing, the rhythm of execution moving quickly now, efficient, practiced, unquestioned, while just a few steps behind them Ethan Cole slowed his pace, his attention drifting not forward but back, toward the elevator where Marcus Ellington stood alone, waiting, hands loosely at his sides, posture relaxed but grounded in a way that did not match the role he had been given in that room, and Ethan hesitated, just for a moment, before stepping out of formation, turning slightly, drawn by something he could not fully explain, because there was a detail that refused to settle in his mind, one small inconsistency that kept repeating. Marcus had never signed, and yet he had never been dismissed, never corrected, never replaced, which meant one of two things: either the deal did not require him, or the room had misunderstood who he was entirely. And as the elevator doors opened with a quiet chime, Marcus stepped inside, glancing once at Ethan, not with surprise, not with recognition, but with a calm acknowledgement that felt deliberate, as if he had expected someone to notice, eventually, and then the doors closed, leaving Ethan standing there with a question that was no longer easy to ignore. Back in the hallway, Victoria paused near the glass wall overlooking the city, her reflection sharp against the skyline, her expression composed but focused. As one of her senior partners leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, "Are we certain about him?" he asked, not naming Marcus, but not needing to, and Victoria did not hesitate, her answer immediate, firm. "He is not part of the execution chain," she said, brushing off the concern as if it had no weight. "Legal cleared the structure, we move forward," and that was enough to silence doubt, enough to maintain momentum, because confidence, when delivered without hesitation, often replaced certainty in rooms like this, and within minutes her team dispersed, each person moving toward their role in what they believed was a secured future, unaware that the foundation beneath it had already begun to shift, not loudly, not visibly, but in ways that did not announce themselves until it was too late to adjust. Across town, Marcus stepped out of the elevator into a quieter space, a private floor where the noise of deals and negotiations did not reach, his phone in his hand now, screen lit with a series of confirmations, timestamps precise, language concise, actions already in motion, and he read them without expression, without urgency, as if reviewing something long planned rather than newly triggered, because for him, this was not reaction, it was alignment, the execution of a system that had been built to respond not to words, but to patterns, and the pattern had just repeated itself in a room overlooking Manhattan, the same pattern he had seen years ago in smaller spaces, with smaller stakes, but the same underlying assumption, that presence did not equal power, that silence meant absence, and as he walked toward his office, the city moving beyond the glass in endless motion, Marcus did not look back, did not reconsider, did not question what came next, because in his world, decisions like that handshake, or the refusal of one, were never small, they were signals, and signals, when understood correctly, always led to consequences that extended far beyond the moment they were made. By late afternoon the city had already moved on from the meeting, traffic flowing, markets fluctuating, headlines cycling through the usual noise, but inside Victoria Hale's office the energy was sharper, more focused, her team spread across a long polished table reviewing rollout schedules, legal confirmations, and investor communications, everything moving with the efficiency of a deal they believed was already secured. "We push the first wave of capital allocation before close tomorrow," she said, tapping a document with precise confidence. "I want every partner aligned before the opening bell," and around her the room responded in rhythm, assistants confirming timelines, analysts verifying projections, the structure of control holding firm, or at least appearing to, because beneath the surface, in systems no one in that room was watching closely enough, something had already begun to shift, small at first, almost invisible. A delay in a confirmation, a request for revalidation, a flagged transfer that required secondary approval, minor things on their own, easy to dismiss, and that is exactly what they did, dismissing each anomaly as routine friction in deals of this scale, because confidence tends to filter out anything that does not match expectation. An expectation in that room was absolute. Across the table Ethan Cole sat quieter than before, his notes untouched now, his attention drifting between the documents and the subtle inconsistencies appearing in the data feeds, because he noticed them, not clearly enough to define, but enough to feel, a pattern that did not align with the certainty everyone else was projecting, and he hesitated before speaking, then finally leaned forward slightly. "There is a delay in the primary funding channel," he said carefully, choosing his words with caution, and Victoria did not even look up at first, then escalated, she replied, her tone smooth, dismissive, "We do not slow execution for minor technical issues," and that was the end of it, at least for her, but not for Ethan, who watched as another notification appeared, then another, each one subtle, each one individually explainable, but together forming something harder to ignore, something that felt less like error and more like intervention. Miles away Marcus Ellington sat in a quieter office, the kind of space where decisions did not need to be announced to be understood, his screen filled with structured updates, timelines, confirmations from teams that operated far beyond the visibility of a single deal room, and he read them the way he had read the room earlier that day, calmly, without urgency, because for him this was not escalation, it was sequence, each step unfolding exactly where it needed to, each system responding to a signal that had already been sent, and that signal had nothing to do with numbers or contracts. It had everything to do with what had been revealed in that moment of Refusal, that brief decision that exposed a pattern he had spent years building systems to respond to, and as another confirmation appeared on his screen, one that shifted the scale from subtle to irreversible, Marcus leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged, his voice quiet as he spoke to no one in particular. Now it moves, and back in Victoria's office the room continued forward, unaware that the delays were no longer delays, that the friction was no longer incidental, that the structure they believed they controlled was already being redefined in real time, not by argument, not by confrontation, but by something far more precise, something that did not need to enter the room to change everything inside it. By early evening the confidence in Victoria Hale's office had not disappeared, but it had changed shape, tightened at the edges, sharpened by small inconsistencies that refused to resolve, the kind that did not crash systems or trigger alarms but lingered just long enough to disrupt rhythm, and rhythm was everything in a deal of this size. "Why is the secondary channel still pending?" one of the senior analysts asked, his voice controlled but no longer casual, and this time Victoria looked up. Not with concern but with irritation. "Because someone has not escalated it correctly," she replied, her tone firm, redirecting pressure instead of absorbing it, because control was not just about decisions, it was about maintaining the perception of them, and for a moment that worked, the room adjusting, people moving faster, speaking more precisely, trying to close gaps that should not have existed in the first place. But then another alert appeared, not on one screen but several, quiet notifications that did not match the expected flow of capital, subtle language that suggested review, reassessment, verification, words that did not belong in a finalized transaction, and Ethan Cole saw it again, clearer this time, a pattern that was no longer coincidence, his voice lower now but more certain. "This is not a delay," he said, eyes fixed on the data, "something is pulling back exposure," and the room paused, not completely, but enough for the shift to be felt, because that word exposure carried weight, it suggested intention, not error, and Victoria's expression hardened slightly, her posture straightening as if pushing against the implication itself. "That is not possible," she said, each word deliberate, controlled. The structure was cleared and confirmed, but even as she spoke, another confirmation failed to arrive, another expected flow stalled, and somewhere in the back of her mind something unfamiliar surfaced. Not fear, not yet, but a disruption in certainty. A question she was not ready to ask out loud. Across the city Marcus Ellington stood by the window of his office, the skyline now fading into evening light, his phone resting in his hand. Updates continuing to arrive in precise intervals, each one confirming that the system was not just responding, it was aligning, and he did not rush, did not react, because nothing happening now was unexpected, it was simply the continuation of a process that had already been set in motion the moment that handshake was refused, the moment the pattern revealed itself again, and in his world patterns were not ignored. They were addressed at scale, and as one final update appeared, shifting the status from conditional to active, Marcus allowed himself the smallest nod, not of satisfaction, but of confirmation, because what came next was no longer adjustable, it was inevitable. Back in Victoria's office the room was no longer moving in perfect rhythm, voices overlapping slightly, questions surfacing more quickly than answers could contain them, and for the first time that day the certainty that had filled the space began to thin, replaced by something more fragile, something that did not announce itself but could be felt in the way people looked at each other before speaking, in the way confirmations were no longer assumed but requested twice, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes no longer searching but understanding, because the pattern had completed itself in his mind, the meeting, the silence, the missing signature, the calm, it all pointed to one conclusion that no one else had said yet, and as he looked toward Victoria, who was still holding the room together, through force of will and confidence, he realized something that made the air feel heavier. This was not a deal moving forward, this was something being quietly undone in real time, and no one in that room, not even Victoria, had yet understood how far it had already gone. The room did not collapse all at once, it tightened, slowly, like pressure building beneath a surface that still looked intact, and Victoria Hale felt it now, not as panic, but as resistance, something pushing back against the control she had maintained all day, the screens in front of her no longer flowing with clean confirmations but flickering with requests for reauthorization, secondary approvals, compliance flags that should not exist at this stage. "Get me direct access to the primary fund channel," she said, her voice sharper now, less polished, more urgent, and her team moved quickly, fingers across keyboards, calls being placed, but the responses coming back were no longer immediate. no longer aligned, each answer slightly different, slightly delayed, enough to break the rhythm that had carried them through the day. And Ethan Cole watched it unfold with a stillness that mirrored someone else he had seen earlier. Because now it was undeniable, this was not friction, this was reversal, and it had started long before any of them noticed, his mind tracing it back, step by step, the meeting, the silence, the missing signature, the message Marcus had sent without explanation, and for the first time he said it out loud, not loudly, but clearly enough for the room to hear. This was triggered, and that word landed differently than anything else that had been said, because it implied design, intention, and... Victoria turned toward him, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. By who? She asked, and Ethan hesitated, not because he did not have an answer, but because saying it would shift the entire room, would force them to confront something they had ignored, and before he could respond another alert appeared, this time not subtle, not buried in data, but direct. A notification from a major funding partner indicating a full withdrawal request under clause enforcement. Language precise, legal, irreversible, and the room went quiet, not completely silent, but close enough that every breath felt louder, and Victoria stepped closer to the screen, reading it again as if repetition might change the meaning, but it did not. The words remained exactly what they were, confirmation of something already in motion, not a threat, not a negotiation, but an action. Across the city, Marcus Ellington stood in the same place he had been for the last hour, the skyline now dark. Lights reflecting across the glass, his phone lighting up one final time with a consolidated report, all channels aligned, all withdrawals confirmed, exposure reduced to 0, and he closed the screen without hesitation, without satisfaction, just completion, because for him this was not about reaction, it was about correction, the system responding to a pattern it had been built to recognize, and back in Victoria's office the structure she had relied on began to fracture in ways that could no longer be explained away, voices rising slightly, not in chaos, but in urgency, questions now layered on top of each other. Why are they pulling out? Who authorized this? How did this pass compliance? And for the first time Victoria did not answer immediately, because the answer was forming in front of her, not in words, but in realization, in the memory of a moment she had dismissed as insignificant, a hand she had refused to take, a presence she had minimized, and as that connection settled into place, subtle but undeniable, her expression shifted, not fully, not visibly to everyone else, but enough to change the way she stood, the way she looked at the screen, the way she processed what was happening, because this was no longer about a deal moving forward, it was about something being systematically removed, piece by piece, and the most unsettling part was not the scale of it, but the precision, the timing, the fact that it had begun before she even realized she needed to stop it, and somewhere in that realization, a truth she had not considered before began to surface, quiet, unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. This was not a breakdown, this was a response, and it had been set in motion the moment she decided someone in that room did not belong. The silence that followed was no longer controlled, it was exposed, stretched thin across the room as every screen began telling the same story from different angles, capital withdrawals confirmed, liquidity channels restricted, partner institutions initiating independent reviews, and none of it asked for permission, none of it waited for approval, it was already happening, and Victoria Hale stood in the center of it, her posture still upright, her expression still composed, but the space around her had changed, the confidence that once held the room together now fractured into fragments of uncertainty, each person looking not just at the data but at each other, searching for confirmation that this was temporary, that this could be reversed, that someone still had control. Contact legal immediately, Victoria said, her voice steady but tighter now, each word measured against the weight it carried. I want clarification on enforcement triggers, and her team moved, faster now, less coordinated, phones raised, messages sent, voices lowered into urgent tones that tried to stay professional but could not fully hide the shift underneath, because the system they relied on was not responding the way it should, it was not negotiating, it was executing, and Ethan Cole watched it all with a clarity that no longer felt like intuition, it felt like certainty, his eyes moving from the screens to Victoria, then back again, connecting pieces that no one else had allowed themselves to connect, until finally he spoke again, not to challenge, but to state what had already become obvious. This was authorized at the highest level, he said, his voice quiet but firm, and that statement did not just describe the situation, it defined it, because it meant this was not an error, not a glitch, not even a dispute, it was a decision made somewhere above the reach of that room, and Victoria turned toward him slowly, her expression no longer dismissive, but searching, calculating, because now the question was not what was happening. It was who had the authority to make it happen, and as that question settled into the space between them, another notification appeared, this time direct, unavoidable, a formal notice from a primary financial partner confirming complete withdrawal of commitment under Contractual Clause 9, language precise, final, and for a brief moment no one spoke, because Clause 9 was not used lightly, it was reserved for structural control, for ownership leverage, for parties who held more than participation, they held power, and that realization moved through the room like a quiet current, connecting everything that had not made sense before, the missing signature, the silence, the message sent during the meeting, the calm that never broke, and Victoria felt it fully now, not as doubt, but as recognition, the kind that arrives too late to change direction, and somewhere beneath her control, beneath her strategy, beneath every decision she had made that day, a single truth surfaced with absolute clarity: the person she had dismissed was never outside the deal. He was the deal. Across the city, Marcus Ellington stood in the quiet of his office, the final confirmations complete, the system fully aligned. And he did not look at the screen again, did not need to, because the outcome had already been determined the moment the pattern revealed itself, and as the city lights reflected across the glass, he spoke once, quietly, not to anyone in the room, but to the process itself. It is done. And back in Victoria's office the realization settled completely, heavy, undeniable. The structure she believed she controlled had never been hers to command, and now, piece by piece, it was no longer there at all. The room did not erupt, it hollowed out, like something essential had just been removed, and everyone could feel the absence before they could explain it, and Victoria Hale stood there with the notification still glowing on the screen in front of her. Clause 9, full withdrawal, confirmed across every major channel that had once supported her position, and for the first time that day she did not issue an immediate command, she did not redirect, she did not reframe, because the structure she relied on to do those things was no longer responding to her. It had shifted beyond her reach, and around her the room moved in fragments, voices lowering, conversations breaking into smaller clusters, each person trying to recalibrate their understanding of what had just happened. There has to be a countermeasure, one executive said quietly, more to the room than to her, and another responded with a shake of his head, not dismissive, but resigned, because countermeasures require leverage. And leverage requires position, and that position had just been erased in real time. Ethan Cole remained still, his eyes no longer searching but fixed, because now there was nothing left to interpret, only to accept, and he watched Victoria closely, not out of judgment, but because he understood that what happened next would define everything that followed, and slowly, deliberately, Victoria reached for the tablet on the table, scrolling through the documents again, not looking for errors, not looking for loopholes, but confirming what she already knew, that the authority behind Clause 9 was not external, not adversarial, but internal to the structure of the deal itself. And as that confirmation settled in, she closed the tablet with controlled precision, her posture straightening once more, not out of denial, but out of recognition, because control had shifted, and the only thing left to determine was how she would respond to it. Across the city, Marcus Ellington stepped into a smaller conference room, one without glass walls or skyline views, a space designed for clarity rather than display, and on the table in front of him lay a single document, already updated, already reflecting the new reality, exposure removed, ownership consolidated, and he did not sit immediately. He stood for a moment, looking at the page as if it were simply the final line in a process that had started long before that morning, and then he spoke, his voice calm, even, carrying the same quiet authority it had in the boardroom. "Prepare the notice," he said, and a response came back instantly from the other end of the line, precise, efficient, already anticipated. And back in Victoria's office the final confirmation arrived not as a notification, but as a direct message, a formal communication routed through executive channels, marked urgent, requiring immediate acknowledgement, and the room stilled again as it appeared on the central screen, not because of its volume, but because of its clarity, because of what it represented. And Victoria stepped forward, her eyes scanning the message once, then again, absorbing every word without outward reaction, but inside something shifted, not panic, not fear, but recognition of a reality she had not accounted for. And as she read the final line, the one that removed any remaining ambiguity, the room understood it too, not through explanation, but through silence, because some outcomes do not need to be announced. They simply arrive, complete, undeniable, and irreversible, and in that moment, with every screen aligned, every channel closed, every path forward removed, the truth that had been building since that handshake settled fully into place. This was never a negotiation, it was a correction, and it had just been finalized. No one reached for their phones anymore, no one pretended this was temporary, because the message on the screen had done something numbers could not. It had removed interpretation, and Victoria Hale stood in front of it, reading the final authorization line again, the one that carried Marcus Ellington's name not as a participant, not as a consultant, but as the controlling authority behind the very structure she believed she was executing. And the room felt it all at once, not in sound, but in stillness, the kind that settles when realization replaces assumption, when hierarchy corrects itself without needing to be announced, and for a moment no one moved, not even Victoria, because movement would require direction, and direction required control, and that control was no longer hers. Across the table Ethan Cole lowered his gaze briefly, not out of avoidance, but because the conclusion he had reached earlier was now confirmed beyond question, every piece aligned, every detail explained, the silence in the boardroom, the missing signature, the calm that never broke, and he looked back up at Victoria, not with judgment, but with understanding, because he knew this moment was not just about loss, it was about exposure, about what had been revealed in a single decision that had seemed insignificant at the time, and slowly, Victoria exhaled, a measured breath that did not signal defeat, but acknowledgement, her posture shifting just slightly, not collapsing, not retreating, but adjusting to a reality she could no longer control, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter, not weaker, but stripped of the certainty it carried before. Confirm all remaining positions, she said, not as a command, but as a necessity, and her team responded, though the responses came slower now, each confirmation carrying less weight than it would have an hour ago, because the system they relied on was no longer aligned with them, it was aligned somewhere else, somewhere above them. And that understanding moved through the room in subtle ways, in the way people stopped making assumptions, in the way they waited for answers instead of creating them, and across the city Marcus Ellington sat now, the document in front of him finalized, the transition complete, and he did not review it again, did not analyze it, because there was nothing left to determine, only to formalize, and he picked up his phone once more, sending a final directive, brief, precise, the kind that did not require explanation. And back in Victoria's office the last layer of confirmation arrived, not as a question, not as a delay, but as closure, every channel locked, every pathway forward removed, every assumption corrected, and the weight of it settled fully into the space, undeniable, irreversible. And Victoria stood there, not as someone who had lost control, but as someone who had finally understood where it had never belonged, and in that understanding there was no room left for denial, only clarity, the kind that comes too late to change the outcome, but just in time to recognize it for what it is. And as the room remained still, no longer searching for solutions that no longer existed, the truth completed itself in silence. The deal had not failed, it had been taken back, precisely, completely, and without ever needing to raise a voice. The room did not empty right away, no one rushed for the door, no one pretended this could be wrapped up with a final statement or a clean conclusion, because what had just happened did not follow the usual rhythm of business. It did not close with signatures or handshakes or mutual understanding, it closed with removal, with absence, with the quiet realization that everything they had been building toward no longer existed in the form they believed, and Victoria Hale remained standing at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly against the surface as if anchoring herself to something that was no longer stable, her eyes moving across the room not to command but to assess, to understand what remained and what had already been lost, and one by one her team began to shift, not dramatically, but subtly, gathering their materials more slowly than before, glancing at each other before speaking, recalibrating their roles in a structure that had just been redefined above them. We will regroup in the morning, Victoria said finally, her voice controlled, steady, but no longer carrying the same authority it had earlier, because authority now required alignment. And alignment had moved elsewhere, and the room responded with quiet acknowledgement, not resistance, not agreement, just acceptance of a situation that could no longer be argued into something different. And Ethan Cole remained seated for a moment longer, watching her, not with sympathy, not with judgment, but with a clarity that had settled fully into place, because what he had witnessed was not just a deal collapsing, it was a hierarchy correcting itself in real time. And that kind of correction did not happen by accident, it happened because Someone had the power to enforce it without needing permission. Across the city, Marcus Ellington stepped out of the smaller conference room and into the open floor of his office, the atmosphere there entirely different, quieter, more controlled, as if the outcome that had just unfolded was simply another step in a larger system that had already accounted for it, and his team moved with quiet efficiency, no celebration, no visible reaction. Just execution, documents being finalized. Communications being prepared, structures being reset to reflect the new reality, and Marcus walked through it without pause, his presence acknowledged with brief nods, not because of what had just happened, but because of what had always been understood within that space. That control did not need to announce itself to be real, and as he reached his office, he paused for a moment, looking out across the city once more, the same skyline that had framed the boardroom earlier that day, unchanged. Indifferent, moving forward as it always did, and he spoke quietly, not as a declaration, not as a warning, but as a simple statement of fact. Respect is not requested, it is recognized, and then he turned back to the work in front of him, because for him this was not an ending, it was continuity, the system functioning exactly as it was designed to. And back in Victoria's office, the last of her team began to leave, the room growing quieter with each passing second until only she remained, standing in the space where certainty had once filled every corner, and now there was only clarity, sharp, undeniable. And she looked once more at the screen that had changed everything, not searching for a different outcome, not hoping for reversal, but understanding the consequence in full, that a single decision, made in a moment she had dismissed as insignificant, had revealed more than she intended, and that revelation had triggered something far beyond her control, something precise, something final, and as she reached for her things and turned toward the door, the silence followed her, not as defeat, but as a reminder that power does not argue, it acts, and when it does, it leaves nothing uncertain behind. The next morning did not arrive with noise or headlines, it arrived quietly, like most irreversible things do, and across financial terminals, executive dashboards, and investor briefings, the same reality appeared in different forms but carried the same meaning. The capital was gone, not misplaced, not delayed, but removed with precision, every channel that had once supported Victoria Hale's position now rerouted, reassigned, or closed entirely, and in her office the screens reflected it in cold numbers, balances adjusted, commitments erased, projections collapsing into something far smaller than what had existed just hours before, and she stood there, alone this time, no team to buffer the moment, no voices to fill the space, just clarity, complete and unavoidable, and she did not rush to call anyone, did not reach for an explanation that no longer mattered, because the explanation had already revealed itself the night before, in the silence that followed that final message, in the name that carried authority she had chosen not to recognize, and now there was nothing left to interpret, only to accept. Across the city, Marcus Ellington moved through his morning with the same calm precision he had carried into the boardroom, his office already aligned with the new structure, reports finalized, transitions complete, and he reviewed them not as a victory, but as confirmation, because for him this was never about proving a point, it was about maintaining a standard, a system that responded not to emotion, not to confrontation, but to patterns that had repeated for far too long, and when those patterns appeared, the response was not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, and as he set the final document aside, he paused briefly, not to reflect on what had happened, but to acknowledge what it represented. That power, when real, does not argue for space, it defines it, and back in her office Victoria finally moved, not with urgency, but with intention, gathering what remained, recalibrating not the deal, but her understanding of it, because what she had lost was not just capital, it was assumption. The belief that presence equaled control, that confidence could replace awareness, and as she looked once more at the empty structure where billions had once been secured, the truth settled completely, not as regret, but as recognition, that the moment she chose not to extend a simple gesture of respect, she had revealed something far more costly than she realized, and the consequence had not needed to announce itself, it had simply arrived, complete, precise, and irreversible, and somewhere beyond the numbers, beyond the contracts, beyond the systems that had executed it all. A single line remained, quiet but undeniable: you do not measure power by who you acknowledge, you reveal it by who you overlook, and in that moment, everything that followed had already been decided.